This week we'll focus on different states of consciousness. We'll start by going over a couple of helpful definitions. Consciousness is the subjective awareness of ourselves and our environment. It helps us make sense of our life, set and achieve goals, focus our attention while we learn, and helps us preserve attention by sometimes having us do certain tasks on autopilot. We experience various states of consciousness, including normal waking awareness and various altered states. Cognitive neuroscience is the interdisciplinary study of the brain activity linked with our mental processes such as perception, thinking, memory, and language. One more recent idea within cognitive neuroscience is that much of our brain work occurs unconsciously. Things like perception, memory, thinking, language, and attitudes operate on two independent levels. A high road, which represents conscious and deliberate awareness, and a low road, which represents unconscious processing. This idea is called dual processing. Let's say that you're walking home and you notice a cat. So the high road brings your conscious awareness to the cat, and you recognize that it's a cat. You keep walking, and then you come across someone who asks if you've seen their cat. The low road processes the things that you were probably less aware of when you first noticed the cat, such as the color, how fluffy the cat was, how old it looked, and what position it was in. Although you likely weren't consciously processing this information, your brain helps you unconsciously process details that weren't deemed important at the time. You can then describe the cat that you saw to this person. We also use parallel and sequential processing. Parallel processing is when we process many aspects of a stimulus or problem simultaneously. It allows our mind to take care of routine business. Sequential processing is used for solving new problems. So this is when we process one aspect of a stimulus or problem at a time. I think it's best to explore the difference between parallel processing and sequential processing with some examples. Okay, so for the first example, I want you to think about riding a bike. When you first learned how to ride a bike, you probably spent a lot of time figuring out how to keep your balance, what speed felt right, and how to use the brake. To do this, you had to use sequential processing. You really had to think about every action you were performing while attempting to ride your bike. Once you got the hang of riding your bike, a lot of that information became more unconscious. You didn't have to think about where the brake was when you suddenly had to stop, because that action had already been practiced a ton and it was easy to act on. You don't have to constantly think about how to balance on your bike. Instead, it just sort of happens. This is where parallel processing comes into play. The same might be true for your favorite video game. When you first got the game, you had to learn all these controls. You might have had to play a tutorial to help you learn these controls. But after a few hours, your brain stopped using sequential processing and you started to use parallel processing to play your game. You no longer needed to know what buttons to press to perform a complex move. It just kind of automatically happened. We don't really need to define sleep, but it is basically a state of being alive yet unconscious. So it's when we get to take a break to rest and recover. Even when we're deep in sleep, we have some level of perception of the world around us. We're able to move around in our beds without falling out and be awakened by alarms or by our names being called. We have an internal biological clock called a circadian rhythm. It runs on a 24-hour cycle of regular body rhythms. So when you begin to wake for the day, your circadian rhythm helps tell your body to increase your temperature. It then dips a bit midday, around the time when you might feel like you need a nap or a Red Bull, and drops again in the evening. Our circadian rhythm can be changed with age and experience. The older you get, the more likely you are to shift from being a night owl to an early bird. While asleep, we typically complete a sleep cycle every 90 minutes. We cycle through 4 stages, N1, N2, N3, and REM sleep. These are described in more detail in the sleep videos that I posted for this week, so be sure to watch those. What I wanted to touch on regarding sleep waves is that during N1 sleep, which is the first stage of sleep, you might experience something called hypnagogic hallucinations. These are sensory experiences that occur without sensory stimulus. Probably one of the most common sensations is when your body suddenly jerks out of nowhere. During N2 sleep, you might experience sleep spindles, which are bursts of rapid rhythmic brainwave activity that helps you with memory processing. In N3 sleep, you experience delta waves, which are associated with deep sleep. It's hard to wake someone up when they're in N3 sleep, and they might be totally unaware of loud sounds that occur during this stage of sleep, such as thunder or even their alarm clock. REM sleep is associated with dreaming. We spend about 600 hours a year dreaming. This stage is also when you're most likely to experience sleep paralysis, which is when the immobility that you experience during REM sleep lingers after you wake up. It's pretty horrifying, and if you've never experienced it, then consider yourself lucky. Our sleep is affected by numerous factors. One is our genetics. Genes can influence our ability to develop insomnia and whether we're a morning person. Our sleep is also affected by cultural, social, and economic influences. In the US, we typically get 7 hours of sleep on workdays and around 8 on other days. US students also tend to get less sleep than students in Australia. If you're stressed about finances, you may also get less sleep. How much exposure or lack of exposure to light we get also affects our sleep. We may sleep more in the winter when there's less sunlight, and artificial lights, such as our cell phones, also affect our sleep by both delaying sleep and negatively affecting the quality of sleep that we get. Sleep is such an important thing to get, and you should try your best not to neglect sleep. Sleep helps us recuperate, it helps us think more creatively, it supports growth, and maybe most importantly for college students, it helps restore and build our memories. Sleep consolidates our memories and helps them move from short-term memory to long-term memory. We recall things better if we learned them on a day that was followed by a good night's sleep. So, when you study for exams, it's super helpful for you to make sure that you get 8 hours of sleep that night. All right, so according to a study, 69% of you guys are feeling tired or have little energy. College students aren't the best at getting enough sleep. So what happens when you're sleep deprived? For one, you're probably moody. You're more likely to get angry and experience conflict in your relationships. You might be more at risk of developing depression or experiencing suicidal ideation. Lack of sleep can make you gain weight because sleep deprivation messes with your hormones, metabolism, and your brain's response to food. Sleep deprivation also suppresses immune cells that battle infections and cancer. It also slows reaction time and increases errors in visual attention tasks, similar to those involved in screening airport baggage, performing surgery, and reading x-rays. So doctors, TSA, and police officers should especially be mindful of sleep deprivation. Drowsy driving also contributes to 1 in 6 accidents. So this is all pretty bad, but luckily, if you add more sleep to your life, you can reduce all of this. If you get enough sleep, especially REM sleep, this will help protect you from depression. You also might consider signing up for classes that start later than 9 a.m., since getting more sleep can help improve your grades. If you get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, you'll also probably live longer and be less likely to get sick. You'll reduce your risk of obesity, you'll increase your concentration. Guys, just go to bed. Seriously, right now. If you're listening to this lecture late at night, pause it, go to bed, and come back tomorrow. All right, are you back? Did you get a good night's sleep? If not, you might have a sleep disorder. This table describes some of the major sleep disorders. Insomnia is the most common one. So if you consistently aren't sleeping well, you might be suffering from this. Probably 25% of you have insomnia. Narcolepsy is another disorder where an individual experiences sudden attacks of overwhelming sleepiness. Sleep apnea affects 1 in 20 adults. This is when you stop breathing repeatedly while sleeping. Sleepwalking and talking is pretty self-explanatory and affects 1 in 15 in 100. Night terrors are more common in children, but 1 in 100 adults also experience this. Be sure to review these disorders and be able to distinguish between them. There are three main types of drugs: depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens, which are covered in more detail in another video that you'll watch this week. Many factors might influence someone to use drugs. Biology plays a role in drug usage. Some people are vulnerable to certain drugs. Genetically, researchers have found genes that are associated with alcohol use disorder. We've also seen that if one twin is diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, the other twin is at an increased risk for alcohol problems, which again suggests a biological influence. We also see psychological influences. Probably one of the most obvious psychological factors is stress, failure, and depression. We also see that people who are still developing their identities are more likely to use drugs. Sometimes people use drugs to cope with things that are happening in their lives in an attempt to dull the pain. Social cultural influences also play a big role. Teens who have friends who use drugs also tend to use them. Teens may use drugs because they believe it represents things like attractiveness, independence, adventure, and social approval. They may also use drugs because they believe other people are, and that they approve of that behavior. In reality, most of their peers are doing fewer drugs than they think they are. While it might seem like peer influence is a bad thing, it's also sometimes helpful. If a teen's friends decide to stop using, that teen is more likely to also quit.